Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. It's been another momentous week in global politics. In the face of the United States' rapidly changing foreign policy, Germany has voted to rearm for the first time in 80 years, and more than 24 countries are scrambling to form a coalition of the willing to ensure support for Ukraine against Russia. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon says we don't yet have a formal invitation from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to join the coalition, but if this invitation does come, should New Zealand join the coalition of the willing?
We have a lot at stake in Ukraine. As a small country, we have a huge stake in an outcome in Ukraine that respects Ukraine's territorial integrity and its state sovereignty. After all, any prospective deal in which Mr. Putin is rewarded for effectively annexing territory from a neighbour will have global ramifications. And the reason I say New Zealand's got a big stake in this is not just in the terms of the peace deal in Ukraine, but also its ramifications for the Indo-Pacific. One of the biggest backers of Russia is China. And China, it could make China more assertive if Mr. Putin is rewarded for his illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Right. So if New Zealand gets this invitation, if we accept the invitation, what should we do as part of the coalition of the
Well,
willing?
I think, as I understand it, we've been party to the discussions so far. We had a military representative at one meeting, and I understand that Mr. Luxon also had a phone connection or a Zoom connection with the previous meeting in Europe. So we're very much considering it. As I say, I think in principle we should be involved because we have, as a small country that trades globally, we have such a big stake in a positive outcome for Ukraine. What can we do? Well, if the rhetoric coming out of Wellington is believed, New Zealand's on the verge of boosting its defence budget. And I think we should increase our support for Ukraine. It may be support in terms of training for Ukrainian forces, which we've already been doing. So that could be stepped up. But there are capabilities we have, such as light armoured personnel vehicles, LAVs, that are sitting around. They could be deployed. There's night vision goggles, things like this. We do have capabilities that would be of use to a country that's been invaded and needs to defend itself. So I think the short answer is yes, we should be involved. Obviously, the question is not entirely within our ability to answer. It depends if the other parties want us to be actively involved, and it will depend on what they require from us also. But yes, I do think that New Zealand should be forward-leaning for the reasons we've just gone through.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says that the idea of European peacekeepers in Ukraine is not acceptable for a peace deal. And Trump seems to favour Putin over Zelensky and over most Western countries. So is this coalition of the willing, is it a US-dependent lame duck? Or could it actually be an alternative to Trump's version of peace for Ukraine?
Well, let's just take a step back for a moment and consider Mr. Putin's demand. He had brought North Korean troops to fight on his side and help consolidate an illegal invasion of a neighbouring country. He hasn't asked anyone whether he has permission to bring in North Korean troops. So, as President Macron of France has pointed out, it's entirely up to Ukraine. If they invite Europeans to deploy peacekeepers in their country, that's a decision for Ukraine. Ukraine is the victim. It's not the aggressor in this outcome, something which the US President seems to be having problems getting his head around at the moment. But with respect to whether the Europeans can get their act together, I think they are it's too early to judge, but all the indications are they will not accept a Trump-Putin deal for Ukraine in which Mr. Putin gets territory. And by the way, the picture became even muddier this morning after Mr. Trump's phone call with Zelensky, which Mr. Trump said went very well. But in the course of that phone call, he also said it would be a good idea to have US ownership over the nuclear plant at Zaporizhzhia, which is an extraordinary thing to say, that it would keep it secure if the US had control of it. Look, this is not a complicated situation. There could be peace within 12 hours. All Mr. Putin has to do is remove his illegal presence in Ukraine and take it back to the internationally recognised borders of Russia. You're quite right. Mr. Trump is clearly pro-Putin on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. He clearly doesn't support the efforts of Ukraine to eject occupying forces from its country. But putting Mr. Trump to one side, can the Europeans, if you like, fill the void? Because I think Europe has now reached the point. You only have to look at the speeches by Macron, but also, importantly, Friedrich Merz. Germany has taken a monumental step this week of rearming itself. It's now removed debt limits and what it can borrow to boost itself. And some German commentators are expecting a new military budget somewhere between 3 and 5% of GDP. Now, Germany's already the second biggest provider of heavy weaponry to Ukraine after the United States. It's formidable militarily, and Germany now, Merz is, really quite outspoken in that he will be the next leader of Germany, and he said that we can't rely on the United States when it comes to Ukraine. And I think Europeans are preparing themselves for the possibility they could part company with the Trump administration on any settlement to Ukraine. So far, Starmer, our leadership in New Zealand, most of the countries in Europe want to involve the United States. But it seems to me it takes two to tango. The United States has to also want to perform that role. There's no strong indication the Trump administration wants to be, to use Mr. Starmer's words, a backstop for any peace agreement reached. So, in other words, provide the security guarantees that Ukraine needs.
Right. And it begs the question about where the United States is going. Because, as you say, the gap between the United States and Western Europe is widening. Trump has expressed admiration for both Putin, who controls Russia and its oligarchs, and also for Viktor Orban, who is an authoritarian populist who has eroded democracy in Hungary. Are we actually looking at the possibility of the US becoming an authoritarian state?
Well, it was funny you should raise that question, because I was talking to an American professor yesterday, Professor Ian Hurd, who spoke about the challenge of international order. And I asked him exactly that question, and he believed that the United States was in the formative stages of moving towards authoritarianism. And I think he was alluding to the fact that Mr. Trump has moved against what he calls the fake media in the United States. He's also issued executive orders which seem to go beyond the legal framework of the United States. And as you see, he's been knocked back by several judges on some of the executive orders he's issued. So it's too early to say. And a lot will depend on whether Americans push back against the rise in the cost of living caused by Mr. Trump's trade war. So it's a little bit too early to say. There are some disturbing trends. One that I really stuck in my mind, Mr. Trump was recently interviewed on Air Force One, and a correspondent from the Washington Post asked Mr. Trump, does he not interpret Mr. Putin's continued bombing of Ukraine while he, the president, has tabled this peace initiative, 30-day peace initiative, does he not interpret that as disrespectful? And he didn't attempt to answer the question. He simply asked where the journalist came from and which news organisation. And as soon as he said it was the Washington Post, he just turned his back on the questioner and went to another journalist. So he didn't answer the question. These are authoritarian tendencies. Politicians in a democracy are there, they're paid to answer questions, amongst other things. And the fact that he's very selective, and he has already banished Associated Press and Reuters from White House briefings. So, yeah, there's some worrying tendencies there, and unfortunately, the Republican Party seems to have rolled over. There doesn't seem to be. This is ironic because the majority of the senators in the Republican Party support Ukraine. So, privately outraged, but they do not make their private feelings public about what's happening. So I think that there is democracy does involve a vigorous exchange of ideas, and if that exchange of ideas doesn't take place, and you have a very strong leader who doesn't, and another disturbing trend I've noticed is that his press spokesman, Caroline Leavitt, almost in sort of Kremlin style, has to flatter the boss, and all the time he's introduced as the greatest deal maker on the planet, which of course objectively is not. And secondly, she repeats the president's insults of foreign leaders. For example, when she gave a press briefing on the readout between the phone conversation between Prime Minister Trudeau shortly before he quit and President Trump, she referred in the readout to Governor Trudeau, which is of course Mr. Trump's slur on the elected Prime Minister of Canada. I think that's embarrassing to many Americans. But again, there's some authoritarian tendencies creeping in, which we need to watch. The crucial thing here, Bruce, in answer to your question, is the stance of other liberal democracies. If they remain quiet and complicit, then Mr. Trump will probably interpret their silence as complicity or acceptance. And so America, other liberal democracies, have a role to play to embolden the considerable opposition to Trump in the United States.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.